Thomas Whitmore woke to the sound of thunder. Except the sky was clear, and the thunder was actually the pounding of hundreds of hooves against the forest floor, a sound that grew louder with each passing second, until it seemed the entire world was shaking with the approach of what could only be a massive force of mounted riders heading directly toward a shelter. He had perhaps 60 seconds to decide whether to run, to hide, to prepare for battle, or to simply wait and face whatever judgment was coming for the choice he had made 18 hours earlier when he gave water to a dying Mohican woman, and decided that her life mattered more than his carefully maintained neutrality in a valley where neutrality was becoming impossible, and choosing sides usually meant choosing how violently you would be dragged into conflicts you wanted no part of. Through the leather flap of his temporary shelter, Thomas could see the wounded woman still unconscious on a makeshift bed he had created, her breathing steady but her face still pale from blood loss. And he knew with absolute certainty that whoever was approaching was coming for her, and that his fate now depended entirely on whether they saw him as her savior or her captor. If you're drawn to stories about unexpected heroism, the weight of conscience in impossible situations, and the moments that force us to choose what kind of person we truly are, subscribe now, because this journey will challenge everything you believe about courage and consequence. Thomas was 29 years old, a skilled hunter who had come to Hudson Valley 5 years earlier seeking freedom from the rigid class structures of English society. He was the fourth son of a minor gentleman, which meant he had education but no inheritance, expectations but no means to meet them. The colonial frontier had promised opportunity for men willing to work hard and risk danger, and Thomas had embraced both with determination. He lived a solitary existence, moving between temporary camps as he followed game migrations, selling meat and hides to whatever settlements or trading posts offered fair prices. He had learned enough Mohican and Dutch to conduct basic commerce, had developed a reputation for honesty in his dealings, and had very deliberately avoided taking sides in the escalating tensions between English colonial authorities, Dutch settlers, and the various indigenous nations whose lands were being systematically encroached upon. Yesterday, Thomas had been tracking a deer through dense forest when he heard the gunshot, followed by a cry of pain that was distinctly human and distinctly female. His hunter's instincts told him to freeze, to wait and assess, to not rush toward obvious danger. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and Thomas found himself moving toward despite every survival instinct screaming at him to stay away. He found her collapsed against a birch tree, blood soaking to the doeskin dress at her shoulder, where a musket ball had struck her. She was Mohican. He could tell from her clothing and the traditional tattoos visible on her forearms. She looked to be perhaps in her early 30s, with strong features and an air of authority even in her wounded state. Around her neck hung multiple strands of wampum, the kind that indicated significant status within her community. Her dark eyes found his face as he approached, and he saw no fear there despite her vulnerability. Instead, he saw assessment calculation and something that might have been resignation. She spoke in Mohican, words Thomas only partially understood, something about traitors and betrayal. Thomas knelt beside her carefully, keeping his movements slow and visible. "Water," he said in Mohican, pulling his canteen from his pack. "Let me help." The woman studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust a white man she had never met. Then she nodded slightly. Thomas helped her drink, small sips because she was weak, then examined her wound with the practical knowledge he had gained from years of dressing his own injuries in the wilderness. The musket ball had passed through her shoulder, missing the bone but causing significant bleeding. Using supplies from his hunting pack, Thomas created a pressure bandage, working quickly but carefully. The woman watched it with those assessing eyes, occasionally giving terse directions in Mohican when he wasn't sure of the best approach. When he had done what he could, Thomas faced another choice. He could leave her here with water and bandages and continue on his way, maintaining his careful distance from indigenous affairs. Or he could stay and ensure she survived the critical next hours when infection or renewed bleeding could kill her. The decision made itself. Thomas built a temporary shelter using branches and his oiled canvas tarp, made a small concealed fire, and prepared to keep watch through the night. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering words he couldn't understand. Thomas gave her water when she woke, checked her bandages, kept the fire going despite the risk of smoke giving away their position. Around midnight, The woman woke more fully and spoke to him in heavily accented but clear English. "You help me. Why?" she asked. "You English. English want Mohican land, want Mohican gone." "I am a hunter," Thomas replied, "not a land grabber or soldier. You were wounded and needed help. That is reason enough." The woman's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect. "My name is Tawizra," she said. "I am peace speaker for Confederacy." Thomas felt a chill of recognition at her title. Peace speakers were crucial figures in Mohican governance, responsible for negotiating treaties, mediating conflicts between clans, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with other nations. If Tawizra was important enough to wear that much wampum, she was likely one of the most influential peace speakers in the Confederacy. And if someone had tried to kill her, it wasn't a random act of violence, but a deliberate assassination attempt. "Who shot you?" Thomas asked carefully. Tawizra's face hardened. "Men who dress like traitors but act like soldiers," she said. "Englishmen, maybe Dutch, hard to say. They wait at the river crossing, ambushed me when I traveled to council meeting." She paused, pain crossing her features. "They take my escort, kill 2 warriors, wound 3 others. I escape only because my horse is fast and I know forest better than they do." "Why would traitors want to kill a peace speaker?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because I go to council to speak against war," Tawizra said, her voice growing weaker from the effort of talking. "There are those among my people who want to fight English expansion with violence. And there are English who want excuse for war, who want to provoke Mohican into attacking so they can justify taking more land. I work to prevent this war. So both sides have reason to want me silenced." Thomas absorbed this information with growing unease. He had suspected that tensions in the valley were building toward open conflict, but he hadn't realized how orchestrated that conflict might be or how high the stakes had become. "Rest now," he said gently. "Save your strength." Tawizra's eyes closed, but before she slipped back into unconsciousness, she spoke once more. "If I die, you must tell my people what happened," she said. "Tell them the ambush was deliberate, not random violence. Tell them not to assume all English are responsible. War serves only those who profit from destruction. You are not going to die," Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "I will make sure of that." Now, as the thunder of approaching horses grew deafening and Thomas stepped out of the shelter to face whatever was coming, he hoped he could keep that promise. The forest around his camp suddenly filled with mounted warriors, far more than Thomas had ever seen assembled in one place. They came from multiple directions, moving with coordinated precision that spoke to military training and discipline. At the center of this formidable force rode 3 men who were clearly sachems, their elaborate dress and bearing marking them as leaders of significant authority. The eldest, a man perhaps in his 60s with gray hair and a face marked by decades of weather and wisdom, raised his hand, and the entire force stopped with impressive synchronization. The elderly sachem dismounted and walked toward Thomas with measured steps. His eyes took in everything. The temporary shelter, Thomas's weapons lying deliberately visible and unthreatening on the ground, the smell of medicinal herbs from inside the shelter. When he spoke, his English was perfect and his tone carefully neutral. "I am Kanakwe, Grand Sachem of the Eastern Clans," he said. "We have been tracking our peace speaker since yesterday's ambush. Your smoke led us here. Where is Tawizra?" "Inside," Thomas replied, gesturing to the shelter, "alive and recovering. I found her wounded yesterday and have been tending her injuries." Kanakwe's expression remained unreadable. "You are English," he observed. "Englishmen ambushed and attempted to kill her. Why should I believe you are not one of them, keeping her alive for ransom or information? Because if I wanted ransom or information, I would have taken her to a colonial settlement where I could claim reward and protection." Thomas said evenly. "Instead, I stayed in the forest, exposed to both your warriors and whoever tried to kill her. That is not the action of a conspirator." The sachem studied Thomas for a long moment. Then Tawizra's voice came from inside the shelter, weak but clear. "Kanakwe, this man saved my life. He gave me water, tended my wound, protected me through the night. He is not part of conspiracy." Kanakwe's stern expression softened slightly. He gestured to several people who had dismounted, and Thomas recognized them as healers by the medicine bundles they carried. They entered the shelter, and Thomas heard quiet conversation in Mohican as they examined Tawizra's condition. One of the other sachems, a younger man perhaps in his 40s, approached Thomas with clear hostility in his eyes. "My sister nearly died because of English treachery," he said. "You expect us to believe one Englishman decided to help when all other Englishmen want her dead." "I expect nothing," Thomas replied calmly. "I only know what I did and why I did it. Your sister needed help. I provided it. Whether you believe my motivations is your choice." The healers emerged from the shelter, speaking rapidly to Kanakwe in Mohican. Thomas caught enough to understand they were saying Tawizra's bandaging had been competent, that she was stable, that whoever had tended her knew basic field medicine and had likely saved her life by acting quickly. Kanakwe turned back to Thomas. "You have done a great service to our people," he said. "Tawizra is not just a peace speaker, but my daughter. Her death would have devastated our family and pushed our Confederacy toward a war that would destroy us." He paused. "This creates a debt that must be acknowledged." "I seek no reward," Thomas said. "I only did what anyone should do when they find someone injured." "Nevertheless, a debt exists," Kanakwe replied, "and debts among our people are taken seriously." He looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed gratitude and calculation. "But there's also the matter of the ambush itself. You say you are a hunter, that you know this valley well. Would you be willing to help us find the men who did this?" Thomas felt a familiar pull between self-preservation and conscience. Getting involved in hunting down assassins would make him a target, would destroy any remaining neutrality he possessed. But looking at the shelter where Tawizra lay recovering, remembering her words about war serving only those who profited from destruction, he found he couldn't refuse. "I will help," he said. Over the following days, Thomas found himself riding with a select group of Mohican warriors, tracking the men who had ambushed Tawizra. The search took them along the river trails where the attack had occurred, and Thomas used his hunter skills to read the signs that others might have missed. Boot prints in soft earth, broken branches at specific heights indicating European riders rather than indigenous ones, discarded items that suggested the attackers had fled hastily after Tawizra escaped. The trail led them to a small trading outpost operated by a man named Richard Caldwell, an Englishman who had a reputation for dealing in goods of questionable origin. When Thomas and the warriors arrived, Caldwell's face went pale at seeing a white hunter accompanied by armed Mohican warriors. "Caldwell," Thomas said without preamble, "we are looking for information about men who attacked a Mohican peace delegation 3 days ago. The attack happened near the river crossing, and the trail leads here. I know nothing about any attack." Caldwell stammered, his eyes darting between Thomas and the warriors. "I run a legitimate trading post. Your horses are freshly ridden hard," Thomas observed, noting the lathered animals in Caldwell's corral. "And I see blood on that saddle there that has not been properly cleaned. These are signs of men who left in a hurry." One of the Mohican warriors, a man named Tekaheinwake, who served as Kanakwe's personal guard, stepped forward and spoke in accented English. "We do not want to burn your post and take you prisoner," he said calmly, "but we will if you do not cooperate. Tell us what you know." Caldwell's resistance crumbled. He explained that 5 men had come through 2 days ago, nervous and paying in silver to have their horses tended and supplies replenished. They had spoken in low voices about a job gone wrong, about a target who escaped when she should have died. Caldwell claimed he hadn't asked questions, had simply taken their money and let them move on. "Which direction did they go?" Thomas asked. "Southwest," Caldwell said, "toward the British garrison at Fort Edward. They said something about reporting to someone there, about getting new orders." This information confirmed what Tawizra had suspected. The ambush wasn't the work of random criminals, but an organized operation, likely sanctioned or at least tolerated by colonial military authorities who wanted to eliminate indigenous leaders working for peace. If the attackers were heading to Fort Edward, they were probably soldiers or militia working under official orders disguised as random violence. Thomas and the warriors returned to the main Mohican encampment with this intelligence. Tawizra had recovered enough to sit up and participate in council meetings, though she was still weak and needed frequent rest. When Thomas reported what they had learned, Her face showed grim satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed. The council that evening was tense. Kanakwe presided, but multiple voices argued for different responses to the assassination attempt. Some warriors wanted immediate retaliation against Fort Edward, arguing that allowing such an attack to go unpunished would invite more violence. Others, aligned with the Wizard's Peace faction, argued that responding with violence would give the war provocateurs exactly what they wanted. Tawizra finally spoke, her voice still weak, but her words carrying weight. "Those who tried to kill me want war," she said. "They want the Mohican people to attack in anger, so the English can claim justification for destroying our villages and taking our lands. If we strike Fort Edward, we give them the excuse they seek. But if we expose their conspiracy, if we show that the violence comes from their side, we maintain moral authority and divide their people between those who support honorable dealings and those who embrace treachery." "And how do you propose we expose this conspiracy?" asked Tawizra's brother, the hostile sachem Thomas had first encountered. "The English will never admit their soldiers tried to murder a peace speaker." Tawizra looked at Thomas. "We have a witness," she said, "an Englishman who saved my life, who has no loyalty to Fort Edward or the conspiracy. If he testifies to what he found, to the evidence connecting the attackers to the garrison, it carries weight that Mohican testimony alone would not." Thomas felt all eyes turned to him. Testifying against fellow colonists, especially military authorities, would make him pariah in English settlements. He would be marked as a traitor, hunted by those he implicated, forced to choose between his heritage and his conscience. "What you ask could cost me everything," Thomas said quietly. "My livelihood depends on trading with colonial settlements. If I speak against Fort Edward commander, I will be driven out, possibly arrested or killed." "I know," Tawizra said, "and I would not ask if there was another way. But you have already shown yourself to be a man who chooses right action over easy safety. The question is whether you can do so again on a larger scale." Thomas thought about the past 5 years in the valley, about the increasing violence he had witnessed, about the families destroyed by conflicts orchestrated by powerful men who never faced consequences for their manipulations. He thought about Tawizra, this woman who had dedicated her life to preventing unnecessary war, who had nearly died for her convictions. "I will testify," he said, "not just because you asked, but because remaining silent makes me complicit in the violence." The plan that emerged from the council was audacious. Rather than attack Fort Edward or even confront its commander directly, they would appeal to higher colonial authorities. Tawizra had contacts among Dutch administrators who were often at odds with English military leadership, and who might be willing to investigate accusations of unauthorized violence that threatened regional stability. Thomas, along with Tawizra and a small diplomatic delegation, would travel to the Dutch settlement of Albany, where colonial officials from multiple nations met to discuss trade and territorial issues. There, Thomas would present his evidence and testimony to a mixed council, putting pressure on English authorities to investigate their own military's actions. The journey to Albany took 4 days. Thomas rode alongside Tawizra, who insisted on making the trip despite her healer's concerns about her incomplete recovery during the long hours of travel. They talked about their very different lives and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. "You gave up your neutrality for me," Tawizra observed during one evening's rest. "You cannot return to being the solitary hunter who avoids all conflicts." "No," Thomas agreed, "I cannot. But I am beginning to understand that neutrality in the face of injustice is itself a choice, and not an honorable one." The council chamber in Albany was filled with representatives from English, Dutch, and French colonial administrations, along with sachems from several indigenous nations, including the Mohican Confederacy. The room itself reflected the complex politics of the region, with flags and emblems representing different powers arranged with careful attention to protocol and precedent. Thomas stood before this assembly feeling acutely out of place, a simple hunter about to accuse military officers of orchestrating political assassination. The Dutch administrator who presided over the session, a man named Peter van Rensselaer, called the council to order and invited Tawizra to present her case. She stood with visible effort, her shoulders still bandaged beneath her formal diplomatic dress, and spoke with a clarity and precision that had made her a respected peace negotiator. She detailed the ambush, the deliberate nature of the attack, the killing of her escort warriors, and the evidence connecting the attackers to Fort Edward. Then she gestured to Thomas. This man, an English hunter with no prior connection to our people, found me dying and chose to save my life when he could have walked away or even claimed reward for my death. He then helped track the men responsible and discovered evidence of military involvement. I asked the council to hear his testimony. Thomas stepped forward, acutely aware of the English military officers glaring at him from across the chamber. He presented everything he had found: the trail leading to Caldwell's trading post, the trader's testimony about the 5 men fleeing southwest, the blood on the saddles, the references to reporting to Fort Edward for new orders. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. When he finished, the English military representative, a Colonel Warrington, stood with barely contained fury. These are serious accusations against His Majesty's forces, he said coldly, based on nothing but the word of a native woman with obvious bias and a colonial hunter of questionable loyalty. I demand evidence, not speculation. The evidence is in the pattern, to Wizard replied. This is not the first peace speaker to be attacked under mysterious circumstances. 3 others in the past 2 years have been killed or wounded in what were called random violence or indigenous disputes. But all 3 were working to prevent war, and all 3 attacks benefited those who profit from conflict. Van Rensselaer leaned forward with interest. You are suggesting an organized campaign to eliminate indigenous leaders who oppose war, he said. That is a grave charge indeed. It is the truth, to Wizard said firmly, and it threatens the stability of this entire region. If peace speakers cannot safely travel to councils, if diplomatic solutions are systematically prevented through violence, then war becomes inevitable. And when that war comes, it will consume not just the Mohican people, but all who live in this valley. The debate that followed was heated and complex. The French representatives saw an opportunity to embarrass their English rivals and supported a formal investigation. The Dutch, concerned about protecting their own commercial interests from widespread warfare, also backed the call for accountability. The English military officers protested vehemently, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By the end of the session, Van Rensselaer announced that a joint commission would investigate the attacks on peace speakers, with representatives from all colonial powers and indigenous nations. Fort Edward's commander would be required to produce records of troop movements and account for the activities of any soldiers or militia who might have been involved. It was not justice, not yet, but it was accountability being demanded, visibility being forced upon activities that had operated in shadows. And it was more than Thomas had dared hope for when he first gave water to a wounded woman in the forest. After the council session concluded, Colonel Warrington approached Thomas with eyes full of cold rage. You have made yourself an enemy of the crown, he said quietly. That is a dangerous position for a colonial subject. I made myself an enemy of murderers and conspirators, Thomas replied. If the crown protects such men, then perhaps I am better off as their enemy. The weeks following the Albany Council brought significant changes to Thomas's life. He could not return to his former existence as a solitary hunter, not with English military authorities viewing him as a traitor, and not with his name now known throughout the valley as the man who testified against colonial interests. Instead, Thomas found himself increasingly integrated into the Mohican community. Kanakwe offered him land to build a permanent home on Mohican territory, protection from those who might seek revenge, and a role as a liaison between his people and sympathetic European traders who wanted to continue commerce without supporting the push toward war. Tawizra recovered fully from her wounds, and as her strength returned, so did her work for peace. The investigation launched by the Albany Council uncovered enough evidence of irregular military activities to force the removal of Fort Edward's commander and to create new protocols for indigenous diplomatic travel. It didn't stop all the provocations or eliminate all the conspirators, but slowed the march toward war and saved lives. Thomas and Tawizra worked together often over the following months, with Thomas using his knowledge of colonial settlements to help her navigate European political systems, and Tawizra teaching him the deeper complexities of Mohican governance and decision-making. A friendship grew between them, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening, as they sat outside the longhouse where Thomas now often took his meals, Tawizra spoke about the day he had found her. You gave me water when I was dying, she said. Such a simple thing, yet it changed everything. You could have passed by, could have told yourself it was not your concern. Why did you stop? Thomas considered the question carefully. I think, he said slowly, that I was tired of walking past suffering and telling myself it was not my problem. 4 or 5 years I moved through this valley seeing injustice and telling myself I was just a hunter, that these conflicts were not mine to engage with. When I saw you bleeding, something in me refused to keep walking. I am not sure I can explain it better than that. You do not need to explain it better. Tawizra said, some actions are too fundamental to require explanation. Compassion is like that. Either you have it or you do not. She paused, then continued. My people have a saying, a single cup of water given freely is worth more than a river hoarded selfishly. You gave freely when you had no obligation to do so. That is the essence of being human, I think. Recognizing our connection to others, even when custom or law or fear tells us we are separate. Years later, when Thomas was an established member of the Mohican community, married to a woman from Kanakwe's clan, and raising children who moved fluidly between Mohican and European worlds, he would tell the story of meeting Tawizra to anyone who would listen. He would describe the choice he faced, to walk away from a dying woman or to help despite the complications it would bring. And he would explain that giving her water had not been a heroic decision or a calculated choice. It had simply been the moment when he stopped lying to himself about who he wanted to be, the moment when he chose connection over isolation, conscience over convenience, humanity over the fear that had kept him solitary for so long. The Hudson Valley never achieved lasting peace in Thomas's lifetime. The forces pushing toward conflict were too powerful, the colonial appetite for land too insatiable, the indigenous nations too fragmented to mount unified resistance. But because of Tawizra's work, because of the investigations forced by testimony like Thomas's, the violence was slower, less total, more complicated for those who profited from it. And in the spaces created by that complication, individual relationships flourished, traders who dealt fairly, families of mixed heritage who navigated multiple worlds, people like Thomas who proved that the divides between nations and cultures were not as absolute as power structures insisted they must be, all because one hunter stopped when he could have walked past, gave water when he could have hoarded it, chose compassion when neutrality would have been safer. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that our small acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. Leave a comment about which moment touched you most deeply. Your support helps me continue creating these stories about choosing humanity over fear, about the courage required to simply help when help is needed, and about the truth that we are all connected by invisible threads of shared existence. Thank you for being here. And remember that somewhere today, someone is dying of thirst, and you have water to give. May we all have the wisdom to recognize those moments and the courage to act on them, even when doing so will complicate our carefully ordered lives. Until next time, stay compassionate, stay brave, and never underestimate the power of one cup of water given freely.